What if Harry and Draco were brothers? Part 1. The cries of a baby echoed through the halls of Malfoy Manor, piercing the silence of the grand estate. Narcissa Malfoy, exhausted but relieved, cradled the newborn in her arms. His tiny fingers curled around hers, his green eyes, so unlike the gray of the Malfoy lineage, staring up at her with an almost knowing intensity. Lucius Malfoy stood beside her, his expression unreadable as he observed the child. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice careful but firm. Narcissa nodded, her fingers tightening around the baby. "Lily was my friend once," she said softly, though there was hesitation in her voice. "And when she came to me, when she begged me to take him, I couldn't refuse." A long pause stretched between them, the weight of the decision sinking in. When the Dark Lord came for the Potters, Lily had known her son was not safe. She had turned to the one person she believed could help, Narcissa Malfoy. And despite the consequences, despite the danger, Narcissa had accepted the child as her own. Draco, barely a year old, lay in his crib nearby, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He had a brother now, a brother who would grow up alongside him, who would share his name, his legacy. Lucius exhaled sharply. "We will raise him as a Malfoy," he declared, his tone final. "He will be no different from Draco. The truth must never be known." And so the story of Harry Potter, son of Lily and James, was rewritten. Years passed, and the two boys grew up together in the grand halls of Malfoy Manor. From the outside, they were indistinguishable, both raised with the same manners, both dressed in the finest robes, both trained in the pureblood traditions their father held so dear. But beneath the surface, Harry was different. Where Draco flourished in the shadows of their father's expectations, Harry questioned them. Where Draco basked in the privilege of their name, Harry felt its weight like a chain. "Why do we have to hate Muggleborns?" Harry asked one evening, frowning as he watched Lucius lecture Draco on the importance of blood purity. "Why does it matter?" Lucius's gaze snapped to him, cold and sharp. "Because it is the way of the world, Hadrian." That was the name they had given him, Hadrian Malfoy. Harry knew it was not the one he had been born with, though he did not know why. "You will learn in time." Draco smirked, nudging Harry in the ribs. "Don't ask so many questions, Hadrian. Father doesn't like it when you do." Harry scowled but said nothing. He could feel it, this wrongness in their lives. Something was missing, something that did not fit. When their Hogwarts letters arrived, the excitement in the air was palpable. Narcissa fussed over their robes, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles, while Lucius reminded them, again, of the Malfoy legacy they were to uphold. On the train, Draco naturally gravitated towards Crabbe and Goyle, but Harry found himself drawn to the red-haired boy sitting alone by the window. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, ignoring Draco's warning glare from across the compartment. The boy looked up, surprised. "Sure. I'm Ron, by the way. Ron Weasley." Draco made a disgusted noise from the other side of the carriage, but Harry barely noticed. He extended his hand, grinning. "I'm Harry," he paused, the name foreign on his tongue. "Hadrian Malfoy." Ron's eyebrows shot up. "Malfoy?" His expression turned wary, as if he expected an insult to follow. Harry hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I think we'll get along just fine." Little did he know, this small act of defiance would be the first crack in the foundation of the life he had always known. The Sorting Hat barely touched Draco's head before shouting, "Slytherin." Cheers erupted from the Slytherin table as he strutted over, smirking with satisfaction. Harry, or rather Hadrian, sat next, gripping the edges of the stool as the Sorting Hat settled over his head. "Well, well," a voice whispered in his mind. "A Malfoy, but not quite. There's something different about you." Harry stiffened. "What do you mean?" The Hat chuckled. "A fire burns inside you, one that does not belong in the shadows of Slytherin. And yet, you have ambition potential." Harry's gaze flickered toward Draco, already surrounded by their father's expectations. If he was sorted into Slytherin, his path would be clear. But did he want that? Not Slytherin, he thought, heart pounding. Just like, the Hat hesitated. Curious. Very well, if not Slytherin, then it had better be Gryffindor. The room fell silent for a fraction of a second before the Gryffindor table erupted into cheers. Harry froze, glancing at Draco, whose face twisted in shock and betrayal. Lucius had made it clear. Both of them were to uphold the Malfoy legacy. But now he had broken from it. Ron grinned at him from the table. Come on, Hadrian. Something in Harry's chest settled. He stepped off the stool and walked toward the Gryffindors, his heart racing. That night, he lay awake in his new bed, staring at the canopy above. He could already imagine the howler that would arrive in the morning, Lucius's fury ringing through the great hall. Draco hadn't even looked at him after dinner. He had made a choice, one that set him apart from his family. But why did it feel like he had finally done something right? The next morning, the great hall buzzed with chatter, but Harry, or Hadrian, as he was still known, could feel the weight of his brother's silence from across the room. Draco hadn't spoken a word to him since the sorting. He sat among the Slytherins, his jaw clenched, barely glancing in Harry's direction. Then it came. A single barn owl swooped down, a blood-red envelope clutched in its talons. The moment it landed in front of him, the entire Gryffindor table turned to watch. Even the Slytherins were staring. "Oh," Ron muttered. "That's a howler." The envelope twitched violently before tearing open, and Lucius Malfoy's voice exploded through the hall, echoing against the stone walls. "Hadrian Malfoy, you have disgraced our family. A Malfoy in Gryffindor? You will correct this mistake at once. I will not have a son who dishonors his name." The letter burst into flames, crumbling into ash on the table. The entire hall sat in stunned silence, all eyes on him. Harry swallowed hard, his ears burning. Across the hall, Draco was glaring at him, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Blimey," Ron whispered. "Your dad's got a set of lungs on him." Harry let out a breath, forcing a grin. Yeah, he's always been passionate. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Classes that day were a blur. He could feel the Slytherin's eyes on him, watching, judging. Snape sneered when he saw him in Gryffindor robes, his lip curling in disdain. Draco ignored him entirely, choosing instead to whisper with Pansy Parkinson and Blaise Zabini, as if Harry didn't exist. But the hardest part came that evening. As he made his way back from the library, a hand suddenly grabbed his arm, yanking him into a darkened corridor. He barely had time to react before he was shoved against the wall, staring into the furious gray eyes of his brother. "What the hell were you thinking?" Draco hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harry shoved him back, his own anger rising. "I made a choice, Draco. For once, I decided something for myself instead of just being what Father wanted me to be." Draco's face twisted in frustration. "You don't get to just walk away from our family. Do you know how much trouble you've caused? Father's furious, the Slytherins think you're a traitor, and now you're nothing but a disgrace." The words stung more than Harry wanted to admit. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Maybe I don't want to be a Malfoy if it means being just like him." Draco flinched, the anger in his eyes faltering for a split second before hardening once more. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. "And when you realize it, don't come crawling back." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the dungeon corridor. Harry let out a shaky breath, staring after him. For the first time in his life, Draco wasn't just his brother. He was his enemy. Harry hadn't expected things to change overnight, but he also hadn't expected them to get this bad. Draco's words haunted him long after their confrontation. The next morning at breakfast, he didn't even glance in Harry's direction. The Slytherins acted as though he had never existed. And yet, he could still feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. But it wasn't just the Slytherins. The rest of the school had noticed, too. A Malfoy in Gryffindor was practically unheard of, and the whispers followed him everywhere. "Did you hear? The Malfoy heir's twin got sorted into Gryffindor. Reckon his dad's going to disown him? Bet you he turns on the Gryffindors sooner or later." Even among his own housemates, the air was thick with curiosity and suspicion. Seamus and Dean asked him outright if he was actually a spy for Slytherin. Neville avoided him altogether. The only ones who didn't seem to care were Ron and Hermione. "Forget them," Ron said as they made their way to Charms. "They'll get over it. You're here, aren't you? That's all that matters." Harry wished it were that simple. By the time they reached their lesson, he was already in a foul mood. Flitwick paired them up for levitation practice, and of course, Draco ended up across the room with Pansy Parkinson, loudly declaring how embarrassing some people were at spell work. Harry clenched his teeth, gripping his wand a little tighter. Wingardium Leviosa, Hermione demonstrated, making the feather in front of her rise smoothly into the air. Ron groaned as his own feather barely twitched. You're such a nightmare, Hermione. Harry waved his wand, trying to mimic Hermione's precise movement. Wingardium Leviosa. The feather wobbled before lifting into the air. Hermione beamed. See? You've got it. A loud scoff cut through the room. Of course he got it, Draco sneered. He's still a Malfoy, isn't he? The words dripped with mockery, and for a moment, Harry saw red. Before he even realized what he was doing, he flicked his wand sharply. Draco's feather shot up and smacked him straight in the face. The room went dead silent. Draco's hand flew to his cheek, his gray eyes flashing with fury. Pansy gasped, and the Slytherins immediately started whispering. Even Ron looked impressed. Flitwick clapped his hands together. Excellent control of the spell, Mr. Malfoy. Ah, Hadrian. Draco was still staring at him, nostrils flaring. Harry smirked. Guess I'm just full of surprises. The moment class ended, he barely made it into the hallway before a firm hand grabbed his wrist. Draco yanked him into a corner, his expression unreadable. What was that? Harry pulled free, crossing his arms. What? You didn't like it? Draco's jaw clenched. You're humiliating yourself. This isn't who we are. Harry let out a humorless laugh. No, Draco. This isn't who you are. I never got a choice. For a brief moment, something flickered in Draco's eyes, something uncertain. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, practiced arrogance of a Malfoy. Fine, he said. Have fun with your little Gryffindor friends. Just remember, when things go wrong, don't come running back to me. He turned and walked away, leaving Harry standing alone in the corridor. As he watched his brother disappear, a part of him wondered if they had ever really been brothers at all. Days passed, and the distance between Harry and Draco only grew wider. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was cold, clipped, and filled with thinly veiled resentment. Draco had made it clear. Harry had betrayed the family, and there was no forgiving that. But Harry wasn't about to apologize for choosing Gryffindor. Still, it wasn't easy. The other Gryffindors were warming up to him, but the weight of his last name lingered. Neville still looked uneasy around him. Seamus and Dean were civil but hesitant. Even Fred and George, who joked with everyone, were keeping a careful eye on him. Only Ron and Hermione treated him normally. Ron acted as if nothing had changed, while Hermione, despite her curiosity, never pressed him about his family. But just as things were starting to settle, trouble found him again. It was a Friday evening, and Harry was making his way back to Gryffindor Tower alone after a late study session in the library. The halls were mostly empty, the torches flickering against the stone walls. Then he heard them. Low voices. Hushed laughter. He turned a corner and came face to face with a group of Slytherins. Draco stood at the center, flanked by Crabbe, Goyle, and a smirking Blaise Zabini. Pansy Parkinson lingered behind them, watching with thinly veiled amusement. Well, well, Draco drawled, folding his arms. If it isn't my dear brother. Harry clenched his fists. What do you want, Draco? Draco smirked. Oh, nothing. Just wondering how it feels to be a disgrace to your own family. Harry held his ground. Better than being a puppet. Blaise chuckled. Ouch. Looks like the little lion has claws. Draco's smirk didn't falter. You should be careful, Hadrian. Gryffindor won't protect you forever. And when they turn on you, because they will, don't expect us to take you back. Harry took a step forward. I don't need you to take me back. For a moment, something flashed in Draco's expression, something almost hesitant. But then he scoffed, turning his back. Let's go. The Slytherins laughed as they walked away, leaving Harry standing in the dimly lit corridor, his heart pounding. He knew things would never be the same again. But as he made his way back to the Gryffindor common room, he realized something. He wasn't afraid anymore. The tension between Harry and Draco was no longer just personal. It had become a spectacle for the entire school. By the time October rolled around, it seemed like everyone had picked a side. Gryffindors, for the most part, rallied around Harry, though some still eyed him warily. The Slytherins, however, were fiercely loyal to Draco, and their disdain for Harry was growing stronger by the day. And Draco? He was making sure everyone knew exactly where he stood. It started with small things, Cutting remarks and potions, a slight shoulder bump in the hallway, the occasional glare during meals. But it escalated quickly. By the time their first flying lesson arrived, things were on the verge of boiling over. Madame Hooch had barely finished her instructions when Draco made his move. "Let's see if Gryffindor's newest pet can actually fly," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Harry didn't take the bait. He focused on his broom, just as instructed. But then, Neville's broom shot up wildly into the sky before throwing him off. He hit the ground with a painful thud, groaning as his wrist bent at an awkward angle. Madame Hooch rushed over, her expression tight with concern. "Broken wrist. I'm taking him to the hospital wing. No one is to fly while I'm gone." As soon as she disappeared, Draco strolled over to where Neville had fallen and snatched something up. "Would you look at that?" He held up a small, round object. Poor Longbottom dropped his remembrall. Harry saw red. "Give it back, Draco." Draco twirled it between his fingers. "Or what? Going to run to McGonagall? That's what your little Gryffindor friends do, isn't it?" The other students started murmuring. Harry didn't hesitate. He grabbed his broom and mounted it. "Oh, this should be good," Blaise Zabini muttered, smirking. Draco's eyes narrowed. "Fine. You want it?" He climbed onto his own broom. "Come and get it." He kicked off the ground, soaring into the air. Harry was right behind him. The wind whipped through his hair as he raced upward, his grip tightening on the broomstick. Draco was fast, but Harry was determined. Draco hovered just out of reach, spinning the remembrall between his fingers. "This is pathetic. You think just because you're in Gryffindor, you're suddenly a hero." Harry didn't answer. He lunged forward, reaching for the remembrall. Draco pulled back just in time. Too slow. Harry gritted his teeth. Draco turned, prepared to take off again, but he miscalculated. His broom jerked unexpectedly, throwing him off balance. For one terrifying moment, his body tilted at an awkward angle. Harry saw the panic flash in his brother's eyes. And then Draco slipped. Without thinking, Harry dived. The world blurred around him as he shot downward, arms outstretched. Draco's body plummeted fast, but Harry was faster. At the last second, he grabbed Draco's wrist and yanked him back. The force of the movement nearly knocked them both off their brooms, but Harry tightened his grip, steadying Draco before he could fall any further. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Draco yanked his hand away. "I didn't need your help," he muttered, face pale. Harry scoffed. "Yeah, sure." Draco's grip tightened on his broom. He glanced down at the remembrall in his other hand. Then, without a word, he tossed it back to Harry. Harry caught it, his heart still pounding. They stared at each other for a long moment, something unspoken hanging between them. Then Draco turned and flew back down. As soon as Harry landed, he was met with cheers from the Gryffindors. Ron clapped him on the back, grinning. "That was bloody brilliant, mate." Harry barely heard him. He glanced at Draco, who was surrounded by the Slytherins again, his usual smirk plastered on his face. But for the first time, it didn't quite reach his eyes. The news of the flying incident spread through the school like wildfire. By dinner, the entire Great Hall was buzzing about how Harry had caught Draco mid-fall. Gryffindors were impressed, Hufflepuffs intrigued, and Ravenclaws curious. But the Slytherins? They weren't happy. Draco tried to act as though nothing had happened, sitting at the Slytherin table with his usual arrogance. But Harry saw the tension in his posture, the way he barely touched his food. He was furious, not just at Harry, but at himself. And when Lucius Malfoy's owl arrived the next morning, everything got worse. Draco had barely unfolded the letter before his face went pale. He clenched his jaw, scanning the parchment, his fingers tightening around the edges. Then, without a word, he folded it, stuffed it into his robe, and left the Great Hall. Harry didn't have to guess what was in the letter. He knew. Their father was furious. That evening, Harry found himself in the astronomy tower, staring out at the vast, dark sky. He knew Draco would come here. It was where they always went when they needed to think. Sure enough, minutes later, footsteps echoed behind him. Draco stepped forward, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something cold. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Harry turned, frowning. "What are you talking about?" Draco let out a bitter laugh. "Father is livid. He says I embarrassed the family, that I let you, his disgraceful, traitorous son, Save me in front of the entire school. Harry's chest tightened. I didn't save you to embarrass you, Draco. I did it because I didn't want you to get hurt. Draco's expression flickered, just for a moment, but then his mask slid back into place. I don't need your pity. I had it under control. Harry scoffed. Oh yeah, looked like you were about to make friends with the ground. Draco's nostrils flared. Shut up, Harry. Or what? Harry challenged. You'll go running to father? Tell him what a disappointment I am. That I should have let you fall. Draco's fists clenched, but he didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, Draco exhaled sharply, looking away. I hate this. Harry blinked. Hate what? Draco hesitated. Then, in a rare moment of honesty, he muttered, hating you. Harry felt his breath catch. Draco shook his head, scowling. You don't get it, Harry. Father always had expectations for me. Be the best, uphold the Malfoy name, don't show weakness. And now, thanks to you, I look weak. To him. To everyone. Harry softened. Draco, strength isn't about what father thinks. You're not weak. You're just, he hesitated. You're just figuring things out like the rest of us. Draco scoffed. Says the boy who chose Gryffindor over his own blood. Harry sighed. I didn't choose against you, Draco. I chose for myself. Draco didn't answer. He just stared out over the Hogwarts grounds, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Harry wasn't sure if they would ever bridge this gap between them. But something told him this wasn't over. The weeks that followed were tense. Draco barely spoke to Harry outside of class, and when he did, his words were clipped, forced, like he was fighting something within himself. The rest of Slytherin had picked up on it too. Pansy Parkinson, Blaise Zabini, and Theodore Nott had made it their mission to remind Draco where his loyalties should lie. But Harry could see it. The hesitation. The conflict. Draco was torn. And then, one evening, everything changed. It started with a letter. Harry was in the Gryffindor common room when Hedwig swooped in through the window, a small scroll tied to her leg. He frowned as he untied it, recognizing the elegant, slanted script of Narcissa Malfoy. Meet me at the astronomy tower. Midnight. Alone. Harry's heart pounded. Narcissa had never contacted him before. Not once. He barely hesitated. At exactly midnight, Harry slipped out of Gryffindor Tower, dodging Filch and Mrs. Norris as he made his way through the dark corridors. The castle was eerily silent, every creak of the floorboards making his heart jump. When he reached the astronomy tower, she was already there. Narcissa Malfoy stood by the edge, her blonde hair gleaming in the moonlight. She was dressed in deep blue robes, her posture stiff, elegant. But when she turned, there was something unreadable in her expression. You came, she said softly. Harry swallowed. What do you want? She studied him for a long moment. You look just like your mother. Harry's breath caught. No one had ever said that before. Narcissa's eyes softened. Lily was a kind woman. She didn't deserve what happened to her. Harry wasn't sure what to say. Then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. Listen to me, Harry. You are in danger. A chill ran down his spine. What do you mean? Narcissa glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. Lucius, he is growing impatient. He never wanted you at Hogwarts. And now, with everything happening, he believes you are a liability. Harry clenched his fists. I never asked to be a Malfoy. Narcissa exhaled, her gaze flickering with something. Regret? No, you didn't. But you are one. And that means Lucius won't simply ignore you. He is watching, waiting. If you become too much of a problem, he will act. A cold weight settled in Harry's stomach. He had known Lucius hated him. But this was different. This was a warning. What about Draco? Harry asked suddenly. Does he know? Narcissa hesitated. Draco is torn between his father's expectations and his own doubts. But he is not ready to make a choice. Harry's chest tightened. And if he chooses wrong, Narcissa's expression hardened. Then he will be lost to Lucius forever. The words hit harder than Harry expected. Draco had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to their father. But if he followed Lucius blindly, there would be no coming back. Harry took a step forward. Then tell me how to stop it. For the first time, Narcissa looked almost proud. You already know the answer, Harry. You just have to be willing to fight for him. Then, before he could ask anything else, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Harry alone with the weight of her words. Harry barely slept that night. Narcissa's words echoed in his mind. Lucius is watching, waiting. If you become too much of a problem, he will act. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The next morning, Draco was unusually quiet. He still sat with his usual group in the Great Hall, but his responses were distracted, his eyes flickering toward Harry more than once. He knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to sense the shift. Harry didn't know if he was ready to talk to Draco yet, but he also didn't have a choice. After breakfast, Harry caught up with Draco in the corridor outside the Great Hall. "We need to talk." Draco didn't even slow his pace. "I have class." Harry grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "This is important." Draco sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let me guess. Mother spoke to you?" Harry frowned. "You knew?" Draco gave a bitter chuckle. "Of course I knew. She warned me that Lucius is growing impatient, that he's looking for a reason to intervene." He shook his head. "Not that it matters. You've already made your choice, haven't you?" Harry tightened his grip. "That's not what this is about. You think I don't know what's happening? That I don't see you struggling?" Draco scoffed, but his expression wasn't as confident as his tone. "You don't know anything, Harry." Harry leaned in. "Then tell me. Because right now, you have two options. Stay quiet and let Lucius control you, or fight back and make your own choices." Draco's jaw clenched. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," Harry said firmly. "You think Lucius cares about you? Really cares? He doesn't. He only cares about the Malfoy name, about what you can do for him." Draco wrenched his arm away. "You don't get it. You never did. You've always had the luxury of choosing your own path. You were never raised with expectations carved into your skin." He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. Harry didn't look away. "You think I didn't have expectations? That I didn't have a whole world deciding what I should be before I even got here? The boy who lived. The chosen one. The Malfoy disgrace." He shook his head. "We're both trapped, Draco. The only difference is I'm fighting my way out." Draco's face twisted with something Harry couldn't quite place. Anger, frustration, fear. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Well, isn't this touching?" Harry turned sharply. Pansy Parkinson, Blaise Zabini, and Theodore Knott stood nearby, arms crossed, smirking. Pansy tilted her head, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Are we interrupting some kind of brotherly heart-to-heart? Because it looks like Draco's about to cry." Draco's entire posture stiffened. Harry stepped forward, ignoring the way Pansy's smirk widened. "Get lost." Blaise chuckled. "Relax, Potter. We're just here to remind Draco where he belongs." His gaze flickered to Draco. "You wouldn't want to disappoint your real family, would you?" Draco didn't respond. Harry's stomach turned. He recognized that silence. It was the same one he used when he didn't know what to do. Pansy stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Careful, Draco. If you spend too much time with him, people might start thinking you're as much of a disappointment as he is." Harry's hands curled into fists, but before he could say anything, Draco spoke. "Shut up, Pansy." The smirk on her face faltered. "Excuse me?" Draco's expression darkened. "You heard me." He straightened his shoulders, turning to Blaise and Theo. "You lot think you know everything, don't you? Always talking about loyalty, about family." He exhaled sharply. "But you have no idea what it actually means." Pansy scoffed. "Draco, don't be ridiculous." But Draco was already walking away. And for the first time, he didn't look back. Draco didn't speak to Harry for the rest of the day. He didn't sit with him, didn't look at him, didn't even acknowledge him. But it wasn't the same cold distance he'd used before. This time, it felt different, like he was thinking, processing. Harry gave him space. That night, as Harry made his way back to Gryffindor Tower after Quidditch practice, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, wand at the ready, but it was Draco. Alone. Harry lowered his wand, heart still pounding. "You scared me." Draco crossed his arms. "You're too paranoid." Harry snorted. "Gee, I wonder why." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Draco let out a breath and leaned against the stone wall. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. His voice was quiet, strained. "I've spent my whole life believing one thing. That being a Malfoy meant something. That it made me better." He let out a bitter laugh. But it's all just nonsense, isn't it? Harry didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Draco's face, the conflict, the exhaustion, the weight of years of pressure pressing down on him. You're the one who decides what being a Malfoy means, Harry finally said. Not Lucius. Not anyone else. You. Draco looked away. And if I make the wrong choice? Harry stepped closer. Then we figure it out together. Something flickered in Draco's eyes, but before he could respond, a sharp voice echoed down the corridor. There you are. Harry and Draco both turned. Snape. The potions master's gaze was unreadable, but his tone was clipped tense. Mr. Malfoy, your father has requested your presence. Immediately. Harry's stomach dropped. Draco hesitated for only a second before straightening. Fine. Harry caught his arm before he could take a step. Draco. Draco met his eyes. For the first time, there was no mask, no pretense. Just uncertainty. But he didn't pull away. Snape's voice was sharp. Now. Draco exhaled and nodded once. I'll be fine. Harry didn't believe him. As Draco followed Snape down the corridor, Harry stood frozen, heart hammering. Something was wrong. Lucius Malfoy wasn't calling Draco for a chat. This was something bigger. And Harry wasn't about to let his brother face it alone.